Hi everyone, this is Anurag, co-founder at TrueFoundry, where we are building a cross-cloud native platform to help companies train and deploy ML LLM models at lower costs and with the efficiency of large tech organizations like Facebook and the others. And today we have Pruthvi. Pruthvi is a staff data scientist at Twilio, and prior to that, he was also leading ML for SAP, as well as a startup called Zap Labs, which was acquired by Anywhere RE. In Twilio, Pruthvi leads the GenAI efforts for Twilio, and we'll deep dive into that today. For everyone's knowledge, Twilio is one of the biggest customer engagement platforms that is used by 300K different global enterprises and companies around the globe. It's a $10 billion company that's listed in the markets. It was founded in 2008 and raised around 250 million plus in funding before getting listed in the markets. And it allows the companies to build personalized experiences for their customers by making programmable communication tools for making receiving phone calls, sending receiving text messages, and performing other communication functions using its APIs. So glad to have you, Pruthvi, here. Maybe you can deep dive into a little bit about your introduction.
Hey, thanks for having me. So I'm Pruthvi. I'm currently with the go-to-market data science team at Twilio. Um, I've been here for about a year now, and as you mentioned, I started off my data science machine learning journey at SAP Labs here at Palo Alto. I was there for a couple of years, mostly working on building intelligence into our cloud applications. And then for about 3 years after that, I was at Zap Labs. So it's a prop tech uh, startup. Um, and the company owned brands like Century 21, Coldwell Banker, Better Homes and Gardens. And my job was to make it easier and faster for real estate agents to use data to help buy and sell more homes. Um, Towards the end of my so between these two roles, I was mostly involved in the classical machine learning world, so mostly building propensity models, lead generation models, and so on. And end of towards mid 2022, when OpenAI came out with the Da Vinci models, sort of got my foot in the door for generative AI. Um, we built a tool which is currently being used at Anywhere Real Estate, where um, agents are using the product we built called Agent Copilot to generate listings descriptions for sites like Redfin and Zillow. Um and post that, I joined Twilio, where traditionally my team was involved in building propensity models for the go-to-market. So things like cross-sell, upsell, next best product recommendation, and so on. And I sort of pitched the Gen AI component to be included as part of our go-to-market efforts. And as part of that, we built the products that we'll be talking about, like XGPT, RFP, Rackflow. And yeah, it's so far been pretty transformative for our go-to-market teams to leverage GenAI and sort of streamline their everyday workflow.
Awesome. Great. Thanks for the context, Prithvi. Maybe it'll be good if we can talk about where does ML play a role in Twilio's world of engaging with customers. So, including like the traditional ML as well as we'll then deeper dive into the generative AI side. But it'll be good for like the readers to understand Twilio's workflow.
Yeah, yeah. Twilio has been huge on machine learning and data science since a long time, but ever so now. So if you followed Signal, which is Twilio's annual developer conference, we've announced Customer AI, which is in the works, so I can't talk a lot about it. But uh, basically, the more recent developments in AI, more on the generative AI side, it's being deeply integrated with all of Twilio's products, like Segment and Flex, which is another product by itself, as against the traditional uh, communication APIs which Twilio has been providing. A few of that is already out in the open. So things like infer traits. So imagine if you're talking to a customer, and in the old world it would have been things like you're asking the customer what what are their traits, and you're trying to figure out where this customer is coming from, what are the demographics, and so on. But now, just with the contextual information from their chats, say with a customer representative, you're able to pull all these traits automatically, and your next correspondence with the customer is powered with all these newly learned information. So that's a sneak peek of how AI would be brought in. But even with otherwise, it, ML has been sort of in the DNA of all of Twilio products since a long time. So if you've used any of Twilio's products like Flex and Segment, there's a lot of uh, dialog flow and inferring the content which has been spoken about as part of customer correspondence and so on. Um, so yeah, Twilio's, uh, if not on the bleeding edge, at least on the cutting edge of machine learning there. Um, One conscious decision that we've made is, especially since GenAI has come onto the forefront, is trying to use GenAI first internally so we can dogfood it. Uh, just because of the novelty factor in there, we don't want to make it customer facing from day one. We test it internally, make sure it's working well, and that's where I come in. So I'm building all of the internal Gen AI applications, which so far has been great. It's been a joy to build, and just the internal stakeholders and internal consumption of it is very encouraging for me. And this slowly is sort of finding its way to the customer as well.
Awesome. Great. Maybe on that lines, like it'll be good to talk about XGPT.
Yeah,
When you all have built it internally for your own GTM teams, and we talk to a lot of companies, who run GTM teams, and it might be a good strategy for them to kind of also use or later on use as a part of Twilio's products. But would
yeah,
love to know what XGPT is, how it is powering your, GTM teams to start with.
yeah. So when ChatGPT came out, we were seeing a lot of our GTM folks just rave about it and tell us how great it was to generate outreach content, to generate emails based on customer conversations and so on. Um, but there were two issues with that. One, uh, back then, ChatGPT was frozen in time in September 2021, and more importantly, all of the content which is shared on ChatGPT, the web UI, is fair game for OpenAI to use to train their models. So just from a privacy and security standpoint, we weren't clear to use. We're still not clear to use ChatGPT, the public ChatGPT version. Um, the good thing about it is if you use their API to build something, then all your data is it's not available for OpenAI to be trained on to improve their models. So that was our motivation to uh, build something of our own. And while we're doing that, there's a ton of non-public information which the go-to-market team uses, such as product product release informations, what's being built. There's a lot of sales plays which go into the picture. How do you position your product against a competitor? How do you respond to objections with a customer and so on, which either way ChatGPT wouldn't have known. So with XGPT, there's a way, it's a secure way to bring in our custom information and make sure uh, it, 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 it gives ready access to all of our go-to-market personals to use it in a way that best suits them, irrespective of at what level they're coming in from. So yeah, we were talking about this earlier. So it acts as a very good leveler in the way it's helping our go-to-market folks. And we've had it for about, it's December, so 5 months now, 5 months now, and currently we are answering about 15,000 questions a month, and we've seen a super good lift in the power users of our applications. And yeah, that's been XGPT so far.
Amazing. That's great to hear about the transformation in the GTM teams. Prithvi. Maybe talk a little bit about the overall backend and the architecture that is powering. Where are the documents lying? How are you kind of collating that into a single document feeding? How are you getting it updated with as new product information flows? And how is the
Yeah.
stack around this built? Yeah.
Yeah, so this was sort of a work in progress that which we eventually figured out uh, to work for us. So I built a data ingestion pipeline called Rackflow, uh, and this has a lot of public and private information which is needed by XGPT. So XGPT is not one product; it's a suite of products. So there's something called FlexGPT, there is something called SegGPT, which is for segment, and so on. So based on the product being used, and we also have user roles, so it could be used by a sales development representative, it could be used by an account executive, it could be used by leadership. So depending on who's using it, uh, a few things change in the application. So one is to double click on the documents that we're bringing in. Um we have a ton of information on our content management systems, which power all our websites, which power our blogs, and so on. So we have APIs which pull those data on a periodic basis. We have hooks to find out deltas in that, where if there's a new blog published, that will be pulled in. And for our non-public information, it lies in a bunch of places. So it could be things like content we're pulling from a tool called Highspot, which is sort of where your internal documents lie. We are bringing in call transcripts from a tool called Gong, which records all your customer calls. We have data coming in from Salesforce, especially the notes which are put in by the sales teams before and after a call to sort of summarize what we've learned from it. Um, and then there's a ton of product documentation itself, like API docs and so on. So all of this flows through our embeddings creator. So we use two local embeddings. So we are using offline embeddings for this because we don't have an enterprise deal with one of the uh, popular online vector databases like Pinecone and so on yet. But also, we haven't yet found the need for it. To be honest, we've we've found good results with offline embeddings so far, and we've gone pretty deep into being able to control it in terms of how we are creating the embeddings, being able to derive sources from it so that we can show links to these documents and so on. Um, so yeah, sorry, I diverted that. The way we are doing it is all of these documents which lie in multiple places is collated and brought into one single location. So think of it as an S3 bucket from where we are running it through our embeddings creator. So for example, for Flex GPT, we use Face, which is an open source uh, vector database, which was released by Meta's AI team. Um, we've tweaked it internally so that we can scale it up for a large number of documents. The default library does not let you upload, has a limit on the number of documents you can upload. So we've parallelized it, added some uh, tweaks which I'm not clear to talk about yet about, but it's, you can join the dots. It's basically allowing it to bring in a lot more documents to increase the size of your embeddings. We've also made it multimodal in the sense that we have a lot of demos, product demos. So we are using Whisper, which is also OpenAI's text to speech model, to transcribe all of them and and add them to our index. Recently, we are using the vision model from GPT-4b to uh, basically make sense out of a lot of charts and diagrams that we have. We have a lot of flow charts, which is used uh, as matrices and workflows for the GTM teams. So all of that knowledge, which somehow used to be tribal knowledge or used to be with fewer people, now is suddenly readily available for all of them. And this is eventually converted into a face embedding. We also create a mapping file which has the corresponding link to all of the public documentation along with the file in which it was stored, so that when we finally ask questions, face has the ability to give you sources. So we are
Right.
able to actually show the links to the actual documentation. So they can click on it, see which part of the documentation the answer came from, and that's our way of reducing the hallucinations or increasing the credibility in our answers. So that's sort of the workflow that we're using right now.
Understood. And maybe talk about this entire, you know, and prior to that, maybe a little bit on the embedding side. So you mentioned that as a vector DB, you are using like the open source. There are two things you mentioned. So which are the two ones you tried? What were the results like? And yeah.
Sure. So for vector databases, we're using Face as well as Chroma.
Okay.
Both are offline embeddings.
Yes.
Both are very similar, and I think we found the similarity search with Face to be marginally better uh, as against Chroma. Um, in terms of models itself, we've tried on the open source side, we've tried Llama,
Okay.
uh, but you probably know it. The results weren't comparable to GPT
Yes.
4 especially. So it's sort of not in production right now, but we have a goal to use as much open source for supportive models. So for instance, this might be a good segue to RFP Genie. We have a tool called RFP Genie, which is similar to XGPT, but it's used for bulk answering questions. So imagine 1,000 question RFP questionnaires which come your way for SaaS applications. So this was a nightmare for the market teams. It used to take them 2 to 3 weeks, and at least half a dozen sales folks working on it, just to make sure all the answers were filled in correctly and it was sent off to the customer before the close dates. RFPs, for some reason, have deadlines to them. Um, so we've built a version of our custom GPT, which is parallelized. So upload a CSV, it batches together the questions, makes fewer calls to OpenAI while batching them together, and then brings them back and pieces them together uh, in the same order. It's very magical to look at while it's populating all those rows. So 1,000 question RFP now takes about 90 seconds, and answered much better than 5 6 people put together who know everything about it, because you've created an artificial brain which knows all about your product. We've run it internally as a pilot. We've seen about 90% of the questions, 90% of the responses used as is without any edits, and a few of it with very minor edits. Uh, so that was a big win. It's currently being used by our GTM team. We're expanding it across products slowly but surely. We want to be very sure about the quality of the responses. Each of it is being reviewed by the solutions engineering team for accuracy. So the reason I brought this up was in this product there's a setting where you can interpret the questions. So not all RFPs come in with direct, straightforward questions. Sometimes it's just a sentence. Sometimes it's not even in English. So there's a transformation step which happens before we answer these questions. We
Oh,
tried to
nice.
use Llama here, where we are saying, hey, if this is the question, this is what it actually means. So we do a few short learning approach before we make the actual OpenAI calls. So in here we had some success with the Llama, but it was just, at least as of today, it's just easier to use GPT 3.5. It does much better. So I'm waiting for the day where open source catches up with that and we're able to use. So that's sort of our experience with open source so far.
Okay, great. So few questions in this. One is like, how do you deal with like the OpenAI rate limits, and what kind of engineering tricks have you put in to kind of make that work, make this parallelized version of this entire system work? Maybe a little bit of deep dive into that will be helpful.
Yeah, so that was our roadblock. So initially we wanted to the first V1 was to just answer these in an iterative manner. So run XGPT through a loop and answer these questions. Very soon we realized we were hitting rate limits. We used we started rotating keys with the API keys, but unfortunately, OpenAI has an organizational rate limit. They don't have a API rate limit. So even if you use more keys, it's you still get rate limited. Uh, Maybe what I can say is, and this is not anyway proprietary. So OpenAI has a very good cookbook where they do talk about how to avoid rate limits. What are the best practices into parallelizing your calls? So we used that was our starting point. Well, that doesn't solve the whole problem because it still rate limits you uh, beyond a certain point. But from there, we expanded on that and tried to batch together the API calls in a way where we are still able to fly below the radar. There's some neat tricks to it, like adding strategic weights without compromising on the uh, user experience of the application, which because our GTM folks are using it. Uh, but basically, that's a starting point into avoiding rate limits.
Understood. And maybe a little bit on the batching strategy. Like, is there a batching strategy that you are using, or is it just number of tokens per batch, or how are you kind of ensuring that one batch and the other batch do not kind of split some information that is crucial for answering a question? Like anything you're doing there specifically?
Yeah, so there's some some engineering uh, tricks required there. As you said, our first problem was when with batching was questions might get split up where it's answering half the question as part of one batch and half the question as part of another batch where we're not able to bring it back together. Uh, the solution to that from our case was using a internal unique identifier for each of the questions within batches itself. And then uh, while you're sending the batches, you're making sure the same unique identifier doesn't appear in more than one batch. So that way, that problem is solved. But still, there's this problem of piecing it back together, which again, using an internal identifier helps with that, where you're able to uh, thankfully OpenAI sends it back in the same order, so you're able to just use the same identifier and whatever parts come back from the response which map to the same identifier, you can stack them together and that's your response. So that's there's a little more to it, but that's basically the gist of how we are doing that.
Very interesting, very interesting, and curious to know, like, what was the reason for trying the Llama 70 billion model for that first layer, right? Like the first layer of interpretation, where the same Chat GPT could have worked. Was there some benefits you were seeing there, and uh, like, was there a fundamental reason for trying it and using it?
The primary reason would be cost. If you can do it for one tenth of the cost, why wouldn't you? But also that it was a much simpler task. We know GPT is very good at reasoning and making sure they can address it in the tone that you want it to be addressed in, and so on. Where Llama isn't yet there. But the first part is just interpretation. If the question is like this is what it means. So we figured it might be a task Llama can handle easily, and it does in many cases. Just that there were a lot of edge cases as against using GPT 3.5. So that was the primary motivation. The other thing is we as a team didn't want to get locked in uh, to one vendor. Um, we've had one or two instances so far, which is really okay, but still where OpenAI was down, where all our applications depend on. So we are planning to have the Azure Open API as well if OpenAI is down. And then I'm actually personally very interested in open source LLMs. I'm just hoping and looking forward to the day where they get to the quality of the proprietary ones.
Awesome. and
Yeah,
and very, very interesting. And um, uh, yeah, I mean, I'm curious to kind of know what is the difference that that interpretation layer kind of adds to the actual output, because we have seen people building these RAG applications, and they directly feed in the question to the model and try to extract the responses, but you are
yeah.
adding an layer, and I want to understand like how much of a difference it is creating. And yeah, it seems very interesting.
It is actually. So this was something we figured out through trial and error, uh, especially with RFPs. Right, the questions are so diverse. The way they're worded, it's even within the same industry. If you're getting two RFPs from two healthcare companies, they are so different, uh, and the GPT models do very well if you do a little bit of hand holding. So if you can tell it,
Understood.
hey, this is what it actually means, and this is the context, and these are the products they're interested in. So just with that, it goes from maybe B plus to an A plus immediately. So that's where the interpreter really helps. Also, it was a necessity for us because a lot of it, since Twilio is global, a lot of it is in languages apart from English. So, and all of our RAG is in English. So all of our documentation is in English. So if we want to query from that, we need to translate the questions first and translate it back. So the interpreter comes in there as well. So that was the reason why the interpreter was born. But yeah, it's super helpful.
Amazing. I think this is quite good, like a very simple technique that people can use to
Yeah.
enhance the output of their RAG application. So good. This is really nice. Curious to know what is the backend of this powered by, like where are you hosting the vector DB, the Llama models, and how are you building this pipeline and piecing them together? How is it ultimately coming to a production use case that these GTM teams are using? So that'll be good to touch on.
Yeah, so for this, since this is a wholly GTM owned project, it's deployed on Heroku, which is owned by Salesforce. Uh, GTM teams get a lot of Salesforce credits for Heroku and so on, which is the reason why it's on Heroku. But we have two approaches. One is a Dockerized deployment of the application within Heroku, as well as uh, direct deployments from our GitHub, uh, where the application lies. Since it's offline embeddings, the embedding file also lives within the same file system. Uh, there are some files which we bring in real time within our application. Uh, we have ways for users to upload files as well as use links as part of their questions. As against, so this is where we slightly differ. We use Google Search API as against Bing or uh, mostly Bing, which is used by OpenAI right now. Um, Bring in those informations as well, but that's mostly the stack. We store all of our data in Postgres, which works very well with Heroku. We also have an Airtable to track all the questions in real time. Uh, we are tracking it down to the token level, so we know which user is asking how many questions and how much does it cost per question, per user, per day, and so on. Um, we also have uh, an analytic component to it as to figure out what are the questions being asked, for how many questions we're using RAG, and for how many questions it's from OpenAI's general knowledge of the world.
Yeah.
What are the areas? And we have a thumbs up, thumbs down feedback for each of the questions, where people can point out if there are holes in our knowledge base, and those get I get a Slack notification as soon as somebody puts a thumbs down there. That whole uh, integration is with Airtable interfaces.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and whenever there's a missing documentation or something which is outdated, we get that updated as an ad hoc tweak to the embedding. But otherwise, the RAG embedding, we have a weekly or a we have one weekly cycle where the embedding is updated, but there's also this trigger where whenever there's a delta in the documentation, so a new blog published and so on, that also triggers the embedding to be updated.
Okay. And I know you mentioned earlier about SageMaker pipeline. So where does SageMaker fit into this picture? If you can connect the dots, yeah.
Yeah. So as I said, the GenAI is one component of my team's workflow. We A large part of our work is our traditional ML models. Uh, and even in here we have a couple of tools. So one is SageMaker, where our models are stored on SageMaker, and we use SageMaker pipelines to uh, retrain those models. Then we have CloudWatch to track the metrics and so on. There's an internal tool called Admiral, which sits on top of AWS, which helps in uh, easy deployment of these models. Uh, as well as for some of our other models, specifically towards GTM, we use a tool called Abacus, which is uh, a SaaS tool. They let you create your own data stores within Abacus, so all your data stays there. You're able to build data pipelines to pull in uh, updated data for your notebooks and schedule notebook runs. So that's another tool we use, but that's mostly limited to one part of the GTM team right now.
Okay. So apart from the Gen AI models, like you're also building other models that are useful for the GTM team, and that's where this infrastructure goes into play, is it?
Correct. So the GTM team heavily relies on propensity models, lead
I see.
generation models, next best product recommendation, and so on. So for all of this, yeah, the classical ML world, uh, for that we use all of this.
Okay, understood. So before we dive into that side, one other question, like you mentioned about Rackflow. So wanted to understand like what is the vision for the Rackflow? What are the enhancements you are thinking of to make it better? And then also around hallucinations, right? Like you already mentioned one or two things you do in terms of showing from where the questions are coming from, but any other things that you all have internally done for hallucinations, or if it's in the plan. So it'll be good to understand that Rackflow component and the vision for it more detail.
Yeah. So yeah, good question. So for Rackflow, it'll always be a work in progress. So we very early figured out that there are these documentations in various places, and there are multiple teams as well which are interested in using them. How do we make sure that we can sort of centralize this process so everyone is not creating their own embeddings, and how do we make sure it can be used from one place? So that's the motivation behind Rackflow. It's still not We're not there yet fully, but we are hoping to uh, use this as a proof of concept where we're able to provide links to all the applications that all the documentations that we have in one place, be it public or private. And with a click of a button, you're able to generate the embeddings, which can be used. Uh, and creating embeddings is expensive, so you don't want to create embeddings from scratch every time. So one of the goals with Rackflow is being able to add on to the existing embeddings. So if a new API documentation was added, we don't want to create the embedding from scratch, but just add on that delta to our embeddings. Um, so that's one part. The other part is Twilio has a ton of documentation. If you go to Twilio's docs page, and one challenge was just figuring out where are the holes in the documentation, what are the parts we're missing, what are the parts which we would need, and embeddings come in very handy there as well. We can visualize our entire knowledge base and see what are the parts where we could bring in more backup to substantiate the answers that are being provided. So yeah, that's sort of the motivation with Rackflow.
Understood. Awesome. I think great to know about this, Pruthvi. Like, thanks for covering the GenAI side in detail. Excited for the products that have already been launched and that are also going to be launched. So all the best for that. Let's take maybe 5 minutes to deep dive on the other side of the GTM models, like the propensity models and the other models, and what is the workflow for that, like entirely from training to deployment. It'll be great to you already talked about the tools. Maybe if you can talk and piece them together, that will be really great. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so with the GTM team, we have information about our customers, what are the products they're using, uh, also leads which potentially did not convert to sales. So, what are the opportunities we lost as against the opportunities we won? Um, so, to put it simply, the exercise is to figure out who are the customers that we are speaking to who are similar to each other. Uh, what are the things we did with the opportunities that we won, and use that as our training data to then make inferences on new customers or existing customers who have more runway, to either recommend them products which might make sense to them. So that's the cross sell model, or upsell them on products and services which might be more useful to them from what we've seen from other customers. So that's the upsell model. Um, there's also lead generation models. So there's like greenfield lead generation. So depending on what we've seen from customers who've been with us for a long time, and the rate of change of their demographics. We call it BDP. It's like CDP. So CDP is customer data platform. BDP is business data platform. So imagine having a golden record for each of your customers. So where they were at a certain point of time, and where they are now, and then using that to identify similar customers who might be in the same stage in their life cycle, and trying to reach out to them with with some confidence score. So the GTM team's time is expensive. We want to give them just the high quality leads. So that's our job with these models, where we are telling them, hey, instead of reaching out to 100 people here, if you reach out to the top 30 people here, this might make more sense for you.
Very interesting. And this is the pipeline that runs on top of SageMaker pipelines and uh,
Correct. And
the rest.
Abacus, yes.
And Abacus. Okay, amazing. And also I know, like, you all have another team that kind of builds like the external facing products and has ML embedded into that. And
Yes.
we talked briefly about it, but maybe you can share a little bit about their stack in terms of what they use on Kubernetes side, about the build kite, and the need for the same. If that will be useful just as a context for the people as well.
Yeah, sure. I can briefly touch upon that. So Twilio has an internal tool called BuildKite, which is basically our deployment tool. So whenever you make a push to production app, BuildKite makes sure it passes through all of uh, the regulatory steps which need to be performed on a app, be it unit tests, speed, security checks, and so on, before it can be pushed into production. So that's where BuildKite helps. Uh, with the app itself, it's containerized, so they use Kubernetes, they use Docker in certain places, which is mostly to make sure it can be scaled without issues. One motivation with Kubernetes is for some of the customers, we need to be multi-cloud friendly, and depending on the customer's needs and where the data is stored and so on. So Kubernetes helps with that. So yeah, from that front, containerization is super important for the customer facing ML teams.
Okay, great, amazing. So I think, Prithvi, like we pretty much touched on most of the topics around the GTM side. Like, for closing comments, would love to hear like what are the challenges you foresee as you build more on the scaling these applications from internal teams to external teams. What are some of the things that keep you up at night, and what are some of the things in plan in terms of innovations that you plan to try in this year around the GenAI usage in GTM teams? Yeah.
Yeah, good question. So, in terms of roadmap, my next goal is making XGPT multimodal, uh, being uh, being able to, and where this is useful is we're extending it to a lot more internal teams, not just GTM. So, think about having each internal team like finance, legal, support, customer success, having their own applications. Uh, and this is where being multimodal becomes important. So a lot of teams have screenshots. For instance, the customer service team might upload a screenshot of a conversation which for which the context is needed to be answered. So that's one of the challenges right now. How do I make the app confident enough to answer multimodal questions? As yet, the vanilla vision models are Vision API is not yet there. We are adding some tricks to sort of fortify that. In terms of concerns and what keeps me up at night, it's the fear of uh, answering something incorrectly or inappropriately, and that finding it way to the customer. So right now we are being super cautious about it and making sure we run it internally with an internal firewall, so that everything is reviewed by a human being first, and we are super confident about what's being shown to the customer. But as we expand, this is something I'm still cautious about. So I'm cautiously optimistic about that going well going forward.
Amazing. Sounds great. Thanks. Thanks. It was a pleasure having you, Prithvi. Look
Likewise, thanks for
forward
having me.
to hearing more.